They called it mercy, but the flames told a different story. The Inquisition did not kill the greatest number of people in the Middle Ages. Yet it was the single force that turned suffering into a sacred ritual, stamping agony with the seal of divine purpose. A paradox so vast it ruptures everything you thought you knew. In the dusty archives of Toledo, I cradled a fragile sheet of parchment, yellowed by centuries. The handwriting belonged to a 10-year-old girl, her trembling loops spelling out a prayer to God. "Do you see how the fire licks my skin?" she asked helplessly. Her words trailed into a smear of charred ashes. The rest of the letter remains forever unreadable. Today, you will learn why witches congregated most fervently where prayers were loudest, and why the very hands that blessed the Eucharist also held the torch. By the time you understand how this machinery of terror functioned, you will see that every one of us stands on the edge of becoming a casualty in our own time, victims of a society that hunts its shadows. Imagine the smell of burning pitch mixed with the sweet scent of incense, the crackle of embers against whispered confessions, the electric thrum of a crowd convinced they are witnessing salvation. Close your eyes. Hear the crack of wood splintering beneath the pyre. Feel the heat sear through your wool cloak. Taste the iron tang of fear on your tongue. These are not distant echoes. They are the echoes of our deepest archetypes, of scapegoating, fanaticism, and the desperate search for enemies within our ranks. How did the purest faith become the coldest cruelty? Who truly orchestrated the hunt? The holy fathers in their ivory towers, or the trembling neighbors who pointed fingers to save their own skins? And most unsettling of all, what did they see in the face of that dying child that drove them to cheer the flames? I won't finish the letter here. Too many questions dissolve into oblivion, suspended between the ink and the ember. But know this: when you watch the embers die, look closely at your own reflection. Who among us is safe from the blaze? Who was really pulling the strings of the hunt? The stone walls of the Inquisition's dungeons in Rouen were as cold and unyielding as death itself. Catherine of Normandy, once a healer of the sick, a gentle hand upon wounds, found herself shackled to the damp flagstones, her swollen belly pressing against coarse rope. The chill that crept from the floor to her bones gnawed at her joints. Each breath felt as though she were inhaling shards of ice. She had arrived wearing a simple woolen gown, dyed in the muted green of spring herbs. Now that same fabric clung to her trembling frame, damp with the condensation of her own panic. Her hair, once the color of ripe wheat and neatly braided, lay loose and tangled, strands matted with sweat and something darker, blood perhaps, from the raw abrasion of iron cuffs. In the darkness, rats scurried, their tiny claws skittering across the stone. Catherine could not tell whether their rustle was more terrifying than the distant echo of chanting priests. The air in the cell tasted of mildew and rot. A single torch flickered in the corridor beyond her bars, its smoke drifting in sporadic plumes that stung her nostrils. With every cough, taste of murk and embers, she felt her lungs seize. Her breath a labor she could scarcely afford. Each inhalation reminded her that she was alive, that her heart, carried like a fragile drumbeat in her chest, still thundered with desperate hope. And yet hope was a luxury she could not afford. Pain arrived in waves, the slow burn of hunger gnawing at her belly, the clench of fear squeezing around her ribs. The inquisitors had stripped her of everything: her herbs, her belief in mercy, even her name. For days she lay forgotten, Only when the torturer came did she remember what it meant to endure agony. He was a lean man, skin sallow from candlelight and long nights without sleep. His tools glinted with a promise of suffering: iron pincers, a jagged wheel, needles blackened by repeated fire. He spoke little, save for a single phrase, uttered in a tone so cold it cut: confess. The first time he set the wheel across her thigh, the flesh beneath it cried out in a wet, tearing howl. Catherine's vision swam, stars of white and gold behind her eyelids, and yet somewhere in the panic, she found clarity. Each shriek that escaped her lips was a prayer, a desperate petition to the God she once believed in. But his silence was absolute. The stench of scorched flesh mingled with the coppery tang of her own blood. Every nerve ending screamed. As the torturer moved to her abdomen, his purpose clear, merciless, she felt the life within her recoiling. A leg curled, an arm kicked, as though her unborn child, too, sought to escape the horror. When she awoke, hours or perhaps days later, time had dissolved into a haze of agony. She found herself alone. Her mind staggered through half-formed prayers. Her hands, though stained with blood, trembled as she touched her belly. There was a stillness beneath her fingertips. The birth came without warning. No midwife to guide her, only the cruel architecture of the cell. Contractions ripped through her, each one a thunderclap, forcing a gasp from her throat. Catherine braced herself against the stone wall, knuckles whitening as she clung to the only thing left to her, the faint memory of her mother's lullabies. Between excruciating peaks, she heard a wet, hollow sound, the world's cruelest announcement. A child born into darkness and cruelty drew its first and only breath. Catherine's arms seized the small form, slick and cold as river stones. Its eyes, closed forever, belied the justice of its existence. She pressed its tiny body to her breast, hoping for warmth, life, some spark of mercy. But the child was already a shadow, a final tremor, and its heart stilled. In that moment, Catherine's own agony transmuted. The pain of flesh became the fracture of the soul. She held the corpse close, rocking as if to lull it into life. The rats paused at the threshold to stare, their beady eyes reflecting the torchlight beyond the bars. Catherine whispered a promise to remember, to bear witness, to ensure that this small death would not vanish into history's dust. Above her, the distant chants of priests rose and fell, punctuated by the scrape of sandals on stone. Catherine's body shuddered with sobs, the single, broken note of grief. She felt each tear carve a channel down her cheek, salty, searing reminders that she still lived, that her flesh, though battered, remained. In the hollow silence that followed, Catherine found a perverse clarity. If the Inquisition transformed suffering into ritual, then she would become its witness. And though her body was broken, her mind resolved to carry this child's story beyond the walls of this prison, beyond the reach of fire and fear. As the torchlight receded down the corridor, Catherine pressed the lifeless child closer, inhaling its faint scent of earth and the sterile tang of death. The cold stones beneath her shuddered in solidarity with her grief, and in that shudder, she felt the first stirrings of a new resolve, to turn her suffering into testimony, her pain into truth. Thus began the true trial of Catherine of Normandy, not before the Inquisitors, but before history itself. The days after the birth were a fevered blur for Catherine. Pain still clung to her flesh like a second skin, but an even sharper torment had taken root in her mind. Her senses, once attuned to the simple rhythms of herb gathering and healing, now hunted for signs of witchcraft in every whisper of wind. She lay on the damp straw that served as her bed, rocking herself in gentle circles, murmuring to the empty air. The memory of her torn flesh and her child's lifeless body played on an endless loop. At night, when the torches dimmed and the cell fell into a chill hush, she would feel a presence at her shoulder, a whisper in her ear. You did this. In her dreams, the flames returned, not in the grand public pyre, but as small flickers dancing at her fingertips. She would raise a hand, expecting to feel the heat, and awaken to the iron sting of her shackles. Sometimes she awoke convinced that she had summoned the wind that rattled the bars, a fire that licked the walls, a storm that shrieked in the rafters. Catherine began to believe, if my body can summon pain, why not punishment? If my mind can summon guilt, why not condemn me as a witch? Her transformation was gradual, like the slow burn of coals under ash. It started with tiny superstitions. She refused to speak the names of the guards. She slept with her lips moving, clutching imaginary beads. She catalogued her dreams as signs from beyond. A raven's caw meant betrayal. The scratch of claws in the dark meant the devil awaited her. Each hallucination fed her growing conviction that she wielded dark power. When the wind rattled her cell door, she closed her eyes and whispered, I called you. When rats swarmed the leftover scraps of bread, she thought, I beckoned you. Her inner monologue became a dialogue with an unseen interlocutor. What if I really did call the storm? This lightning, was it drawn to me? My tears are acid, my rage, a curse. Sometimes she heard mocking laughter, echoes of the Inquisitor's voice distorted. Confess, it taunted, admit the pact you made. Her faith, once simple and rooted in the natural world, began to twist. She remembered praying for her child's safety. Now she prayed to the same God, but with a different urgency. If you are real, stop this fire in my veins. If you are a lie, let me embrace the darkness. In the faint glow of dawn, Catherine carved symbols in the straw. Concentric circles, stars, a rune she had once glimpsed in a herbalist's grimoire. She pressed her fingertips into the etchings and tasted ash on her tongue. In that bitter flavor, she found a perverse comfort, confirmation that she had crossed the threshold into forbidden knowledge. Her identity as healer fractured. Each memory of soothing burns and extracting thorns felt like a lie. She recoiled at the thought of herbs, the same herbs that invited demons, that fed the fungus of witchcraft. She dared not touch them. Instead, she used their names in incantations, calling on them to shield or harm. On the seventh day, a guard entered to deliver meager rations. The torchlight jittered as he set the tray down. Fish bones and stale bread. Catherine raised her voice, thin but unwavering. Do not light the fire outside my door. My power needs no fuel. The guard hesitated. Something in her eyes, wild, unblinking, gave him pause. He had seen many prisoners break, but few who commanded the silence of fire itself. He left the torch unlit in the corridor and slipped away, uncertain whether he protected her or himself. Emboldened, Catherine spoke to the cell's corners. I see you. You lurk in every shadow, she said. But know this, I am no common witch. I am the crucible. When the torturer returned, Catherine did not cower. She stood shivering, yet defiant, and met his gaze. The wheel and pincers lay ready on a blood-stained bench. He lifted an eyebrow. The torchlight glinted off his scalp as he said, Confess. Catherine's lips curved into a serene smile. She lowered her head as if in prayer. I confess that I am the instrument of God's fire, she whispered. I confess that the world outside crumbles beneath my hand. The torturer hesitated, unsettlingly so. He was a man of flesh and blood, accustomed to extracting confessions through agony. But this confession was unearned, a twisting of his own logic. What truth could be tortured from a mind that already believed itself sovereign over flame? He pressed a cold iron to her wrist, demanding, "Who taught you this heresy?" I was born to it, Catherine replied, her voice a single, clear bell. My mother whispered the name of the devil at my cradle. That night, the priests convened. They consulted their manuals, their ledgers of witches and heretics. Catherine's case was anomalous. She offered no clear confession of familiar pacts or forbidden rites. Instead, she claimed communion with fire itself, and worse, spoke of herself as fire incarnate. In a chamber above her cell, candles were arranged in a ring. The head inquisitor, pale and gaunt, leaned over a parchment. He read her words aloud. I summoned the storm in my anger. I tasted it on my tongue. He frowned. A witch who believes she commands elemental forces is more dangerous than one who simply trades secrets. He gestured, and the priests scrambled to fetch more chains, heavier irons, a mask to stifle her speech. Catherine awaited them in silence, humming softly. Each note was a ripple in the cell's stale air, a promise that something wild still lived inside her. When they came, they bound her wrists and secured her jaw with iron. They dragged her to a small antechamber where religious icons were arrayed. Crucifixes, painted saints, a vial of holy water. The head inquisitor stepped forward, holding a leather-bound Bible. Catherine of Normandy, he intoned, voice even, repent or face the stake. Catherine's eyes shone with fierce light. I repent, she said, that I do not repent. A murmur ran through the priests. They murmured prayers of exorcism, splashed her with holy water, but the droplets sizzled on her skin as if they were drops of acid meeting metal. Catherine's spine arched. She let out a low, pained whisper. Do you feel it? The weakness in your faith? They recoiled. Holy men, they had never seen such defiance woven into theology. Her trauma had not destroyed her faith. It had reconfigured it into something feral, unpredictable. Dragged back to her cell, Catherine collapsed onto the straw. She tasted blood on her lips from the iron that cut against her jaw. But in her heart, a new conviction grew. If the world would brand her witch, she would become one. Her suffering would be sanctified, her pain a catalyst for something beyond mortal cruelty. In the darkness, she whispered, I am the fire. I am the trial. The cell remained silent, save for the distant drip of water and the slow, deliberate creak of the corridor door. In that silence, Catherine's new faith took root, not in mercy, not in innocence, but in the raw, limitless power of her own broken spirit. The morning air in the town of St. Lo felt different, as though the very atmosphere were charged. Word of Catherine's imprisonment and her strange defiance had spread like wildfire through the cobbled streets. Market stalls that once brimmed with fresh cheese and salted fish now stood abandoned. Merchants whispered hurried prayers over half-empty baskets. The people of St. Lo had divided into two factions, those who trembled in fear, and those desperate enough to denounce their neighbors for a scrap of favor from the Inquisition. In the shadow of Notre Dame de Saint-Lô, Father Guillaume, once a humble parish priest, now held the title of gatekeeper of sanctity. He proclaimed in booming sermons delivered from wooden pulpits that the Inquisition is an act of mercy, not punishment. His words cascaded down from stained glass windows in hues of red and violet, convincing many that the torture chambers beyond the town's walls were places of healing, where the soul was purified by fire. Yet for others, the horror was undeniable. Widow Mart, whose husband had vanished last month, stood at the edge of the graveyard every dawn, clutching a clay lamp. "I light this for Joseph," she murmured, "that he might find peace beyond these stones." But the lamp's flame trembled in the wind, as though afraid to burn. Within the town's narrow lanes, old alliances crumbled. The miller, who had once exchanged flour for Catherine's healing salves, turned informer when a pair of black-clad inquisitors offered him quarter at his mill in exchange for a name. He handed over the miller's daughter, claiming she had slept one too many nights in Catherine's cottage. The cottage, stripped bare of herbs and household trinkets, now bore scorch marks from torches wielded by the Inquisition's men. Friends who once laughed over ale in the tavern now sat in sullen corners, watching one another for signs of sympathy. A simple nod at a passing traveler could mean suspicion, and suspicion meant condemnation. The butcher refused to meet the baker's gaze. The baker avoided the vintner. Each man stood alone, as though solidarity itself were a crime. One evening, as the sun bled orange across the rooftops, Catherine's husband, Etienne, was brought before her cell. Shackled in ankles and wrists, he looked gaunt and hollow-eyed, the lines of his face carved by sleepless nights and guilt. He had said nothing, refused to betray her, and yet that silence was enough to seal his fate. Catherine, lying on the thin straw, heard the key turn in her door. Etienne's boots clacked against the stone, and she raised her head, her breath catching in her throat. Flames from the torch outside cast his silhouette in brittle relief. His eyes met hers for a fleeting second, hope mingled with sorrow, before the soldiers dragged him away toward the pyre. Father Guillaume took the pulpit that night under the moon's pale glow. His voice cut through the hush. A society that tolerates heresy invites chaos. Better to cull the corrupt than let them consume the whole flock. The crowd, hundreds strong, erupted in fervent applause. Torches flickered like a sea of stars, illuminating faces twisted with conviction. But among them was young Marianne, Etienne's sister. She wept openly, clutching a sooty rag to her mouth. "God forgive me," she sobbed, "for standing here when my brother burns." No one offered her comfort. Some backed away, fearing her tears would taint them. Marianne's grief was an act of defiance in itself, a mirror held up to a crowd that had abandoned mercy. The next dawn, Etienne was led to the square. The pyre stood at its center, a rough scaffold of felled oak bound with iron chains. He walked between two lines of knights, his head bowed. Catherine watched from her window above, her heart pounding so fiercely she thought it would tear through her chest. As the flames rose and licked at his legs, Etienne gazed upward, his eyes finding Catherine's for one last moment. He offered her a weak smile, then raised a single hand in silent blessing. In that gesture lay the entire weight of his love and his sacrifice. By remaining mute, he had tried to shield her, but the Inquisition showed no mercy. When the smoke curled into the dawn sky, Catherine felt a hollowness settle in her bones. The crowd cheered, trumpets blared. Father Guillaume descended from his pulpit, his white robes pristine despite the blood-red dawn. He placed a hand on Catherine's cell door, as though blessing her defiance, and proclaimed, "This is mercy fulfilled. Beware, for the next heretic stands hidden among you." In the days that followed, the town was gripped by suspicion so fierce that mothers refused to share milk, neighbors barred their doors against beggars, and children learned lessons of betrayal too early. "If you see something, say something," their fathers told them, voices trembling. The Inquisition's instruments, chains, branding irons, whispered confessions, had become the tools not only of punishment, but of social control. Yet beneath the surface, a subtle resistance began to stir. The herbalist's grandson painted symbols on doorframes to ward off inquisitors. A knot of ivy leaf, a crescent moon. Small notes slipped beneath doors read, "They fear what they cannot see." In the tavern's back room, a few brave souls met by candlelight to share stories of Catherine's compassion, to remember a time before terror reigned. For Catherine, alone in her cell, the collapse of community was both tragedy and vindication. The same fear that had made her a martyr drove the townspeople to madness. In their fanaticism, they had become the witches they claimed to hunt, seeing monsters in every shadow, seeing guilt in every silence. She pressed her forehead to the cool stone and whispered to the void, "I see you, Saint Lo. I see how your hearts have hardened into coal." Then, gathering her strength, she murmured a prayer, not to the God who had abandoned her, but to the memory of Etienne's final blessing. "May truth survive this fire," she vowed. In the silence of her darkness, Catherine understood the most profound betrayal, how a community united by faith could fracture into prey and predator, how love could turn to suspicion, and how even the kindest souls could raise the torch in the name of salvation. That final night before the stake arrived like a whisper on frozen air. The guards left Catherine alone in her cell, beneath a single guttering torch, its sputtering flame casting her shadow huge and trembling against the stone. She lay on the thin pallet of straw, her body bruised, her spirit frayed, yet at the core of her being something stirred, a slow, seismic shift that loosened the bonds of fear. In the stillness, Catherine felt the walls breathe around her. Every drip of water from a cracked pipe sounded like a distant bell, tolling for her soul. She closed her eyes and embraced the dark. There, in a realm beyond pain, she sensed a presence not of mercy, but of solidarity, a God who did not watch from afar, but burned in her own flesh. In that revelation, terror bowed beneath awe. She remembered the first time she tasted ash on her tongue, believing herself to be a witch. Now she saw that her true sacrifice was not the crime they accused her of, but the surrender of her innocence to divine fire. It was the alchemy of suffering, transmuting flesh into spirit, agony into grace. Catherine whispered into the darkness, "If I am to die, let me die as I have lived, in communion with this flame." Her inner voice, once frantic and fractured, now spoke with calm authority. "I am no witch. I am the ember God chose to carry his silence. My blood is the ink with which he writes his final testament." Rising to her knees, she pressed her palms against the cold wall. The stones beneath her fingers felt alive, their ancient mortar humming with the prayers and curses of countless souls. In that communion, Catherine shed the last vestiges of her former self, the healer girl of Normandy, the mother of a child who never lived. They were sacrifices at the altar of her new faith. As the hours passed, she fashioned a rough cruciform from scraps of wood and cloth torn from her shift. She bound the cloth to the wood, murmuring over it a liturgy of her own making. Fragments of Latin from half-remembered sermons, lines of poetry she had learned as a child, the ragged syllables of her own grief. The cross was humble, but in her hands it held the weight of universes. When dawn crept through the narrow aperture above, Catherine donned her makeshift cross. She stood before the torchlight that shone in the barred window and lifted her face to the sky beyond. Though the sun had not yet risen, she felt its promise, fragile as gossamer, stirring on her skin. She spoke aloud, so that any guard within hearing might carry her words back to their masters. O silent God, I carry you within my wounds. I bear your absence like a crown of thorns, for surely you have chosen to suffer with me. Her confession was not a plea, but a testament. It echoed in the corridor, slipping through wooden doors and into the private chapels of priests preparing for her execution. In that echo lay a question more terrifying than any heresy. What if God is not apart from suffering, but at its center? An hour later, they came to bind her wrists and laid her to the pyre. As they clasped iron cuffs around her ankles, Catherine closed her eyes and felt the heat of her own conviction rise within her chest. She no longer feared the flames. They were the furnace of her revelation. At the threshold of her cell, she paused and raised her battered cross. Behind her, the walls of the dungeon dissolved into the memory of every whispered prayer she had ever uttered. Ahead of her stretched the path of fire, each step a communion with the divine void she had come to know. In the courtyard, the assembled townspeople fell silent at her approach. Father Guillaume stood at the prow of the scaffold, his white vestments gleaming. Catherine met his gaze with quiet defiance. When he opened his mouth to speak of mercy, she raised a single finger. Mercy is the ember that survives the blaze. I am that ember. And as the kindling was laid, as the torches circled the pyre, Catherine lifted her voice in one final benediction. Let this fire be a sacrifice not of death, but of truth. For every heart that fears the flame, let it learn. God is found not in the quiet of safety, but in the roar of the uncompromised soul. The flames consumed her form, but in that conflagration, her spirit transcended flesh. The heat was not agony, it was revelation incarnate. In the roaring inferno, Catherine and God were one flame, burning so fiercely that no darkness could diminish their light. Thus was born the paradox of the martyr's faith, that the purest communion lies not in comfort, but in the crucible of sacred fire. And though her body turned to ash, her ember lives on in every heart that dares to carry the silence of God into the world. On a cold morning in the little hamlet of Saint-Hilaire, 10-year-old Julien stood at the edge of the village square, his small shoulders hunched beneath a woolen cloak 2 sizes too large. Dawn's pale light revealed a world roped off by ropes, cords marking the path to the Inquisition's camp where suspected witches were quartered. Julian's breath fogged in the chill air as he pressed his fingertips against his lips, tasting the copper tang of fear. His mother, Marguerite, had been taken 3 nights before. She was a gentle woman, known for harvesting yarrow and rose hips to soothe fevers. But when a neighbor's child, too, grew ill and died, the rumor mill turned fertile. Whispers spread of whispered incantations and secret nocturnal gatherings. The Inquisition arrived without warning, torches in hand and priests at their backs, and Marguerite vanished into their black tents. For 2 days, Julian had wandered the square, begging for news. The inquisitors offered him bread in exchange for information. Nothing material ever seemed enough for their appetite. Finally, one of their lieutenants spotted the boy's hollow eyes and asked in a soft voice that felt more terrifying than any shout, "Do you know where your mother hides her dark rites?" Julian shook his head, too frightened to even swallow. The lieutenant crouched to his level and said, "A mother protects her child. If she hides tricks in her cottage, she does so to lure you into peril. Show me what lies beneath her floorboards, and I'll keep you safe." That night, Julian lay sleepless in his damp straw mattress. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Marguerite's gentle face, smiling as she braided rye stalks into garlands, singing lullabies in low, lilting tones. But beneath that vision lurked another, the lieutenant's eyes, shadowed with promise and threat. If he spoke, his mother might burn. If he stayed silent, they would burn him too. At dawn, Julian crept from his refuge in the miller's barn, heart pounding like a hammer. He made his way to the cottage where Marguerite's herb beds grew wild at the window. Every step felt unsteady, as though the ground itself might tip him into a pit of vipers. The door, half rotted, swung open without a creak, no longer the warm threshold of home, but the threshold of his own undoing. Inside, the sun slanted across dusty shelves lined with glass vials and wooden bowls. Spices, dill, coriander, powdered roots, lay scattered like the remnants of a dream. Julian's throat tightened. He knew what the lieutenant wanted, the hidden trapdoor beneath the floor's rotted plank. He had seen his mother kneel there when she thought he slept, whispering to the earth as she pressed her palm to a symbol etched in chalk. His hand hovered over the plank. Memories of Marguerite teaching him to identify healing herbs flashed through his mind. This blossom staunches blood. This leaf soothes pain. Now he stood over the same board, knowing its secret could condemn them both. Tears welled in his eyes. "I won't hurt you," he wanted to whisper. "I can't." But the memory of the lieutenant's promise, "I'll protect you," shivered through his bones. He sank to his knees and placed both hands on the plank's edge. With a soft groan of aged timber, it lifted. Julian's heart hammered as he peered into the darkness below. A narrow staircase leading to a dirt-floored cellar, thick with the heady scent of damp earth and rot. He closed his eyes, recalling his mother's warmth, her gentle voice. He thought of the petals she pressed into his palm, the teas she brewed for his fevers. And then he thought of the inquisitors, their torches, the searing flames. He clenched his fists. Fear and loyalty waged war inside him. Fear for his own life, loyalty to the woman who had given him life. With a trembling breath, Julian whispered, "I'm sorry, Mother." He reached down and touched the first step. His fingers brushed against damp brick, and he let out a sob that echoed in the silent cottage. He climbed down 2 steps and found the wooden chest his mother kept, the one filled with dried herbs and prayer scrolls. He lifted its lid, revealing bundles of thyme, foxglove, and a small vial of liquid amber. Now he knew the truth. These were not tokens of witchcraft, but of healing. His chest tightened. Guilt and relief warred. He scooped the vial in his hand. Then, unable to look further, he grabbed a handful of scrolls and climbed back up. Outside, a torch's flame pierced the half-light. 2 soldiers stood guard. Julian held out the vial and scrolls, voice cracking. "She hides these here. She's a witch." The lieutenant emerged from his tent, expression unreadable, and took the evidence. Julian closed his eyes, waiting for the promise of safety, waiting for the end of fear, but silence stretched between the flicker of torches. The lieutenant examined the vial, sniffed it, frowned. He unrolled a scroll, skimmed its script. Then he looked at Julien. "Is that all?" he asked. Julien nodded, tears streaming. "That's all I found." The lieutenant sighed, pocketed the vial and scrolls, and placed a hand on Julien's shoulder. "Go home." His words felt hollow, as though he spoke through a veil. "No harm will come to you, today." Julien ran, the night air stinging his eyes. He reached the edge of the village, where moonlight trembled over the river and collapsed against a willow tree. His knees buckled, and he let the tears come. Tears for the trust he had betrayed, for the mother he had condemned, and for the boy who would never again see the world in simple truths. Behind him, torches advanced toward his cottage. He looked up through blurred vision and saw soldiers fumbling with locks, prying boards. A shout rang out, Marguerite's name, and then the muffled sound of protest. Julien's breath caught, his mother's voice, strong even as it faltered. "I am no witch. I am no witch." He tried to stand, but the willow's roots held him fast. The torches passed into his cottage, and he saw the flicker of flame against his mother's face. She reached for something at her neck, a locket perhaps, and clutched it to her breast. Her eyes met Julien's through the window, and in that moment he saw not fear, but love and grief and defiance all writ large. A final muffled cry, then silence. Julien buried his face against the willow's trunk. The guilt was a living thing inside him, coiling and crushing. "I did this," he thought. "I did this to you." In the hush, the wind carried a single chant from the Inquisition's camp. "Purge the evil. Purge the evil." The chant and the flame merged in Julien's mind, burning away the innocence of childhood. He would carry this day, the betrayal, the death, the echo of his mother's final look, for the rest of his life. And beneath the willow, two shapes curled together, the boy drenched in tears, and the fading memory of all he once held sacred. By the time dawn broke over Saint-Hilaire's fields, the village had ceased to exist in any recognizable form. The low huts and thatched roofs remained, but the spirit of community, the shared hours of work, laughter at the midday meal, the comfort of neighbors greeting neighbors, had been incinerated long before the pyre claimed Marguerite. In its place rose a brittle network of suspicion, each villager bound to the Inquisition by fear and self-preservation. The old women who once gathered nettles at the stream now met in huddled circles behind locked doors. They debated in hushed whispers whether to burn their herb closets or hide the recipes penned in their weathered journals. In these clandestine meetings, one secret admission could doom an entire lineage. A recipe for a poultice became evidence of poison. The use of mugwort to induce dreams became proof of divination. "Keep your eyes open," warned Madame Renard, a once respected matron whose stoop had deepened with years of hardship. "I've heard that even your own mother could turn you in for a handful of yarrow." Her voice trembled, not with age, but with the dread of betrayal. The women nodded, but in their faces lay the knowledge that mercy had died alongside Marguerite. The only currency now was denunciation. Men, too, found new purpose as unpaid enforcers. They erected crude barricades of timber across the village's narrow alleys, forcing travelers to pass under the gaze of armed youths carrying wooden staves. By midday, every stranger was a potential conspirator. A peddler with a rusty kettle was accused of forging charms. a weary pilgrim was rumored to have danced with demons under moonlight. The town's guard, once tasked with keeping the peace, now enforced the Inquisition's will with gusto. But the most insidious conflict took root among the women themselves. Mothers who once shared midwifery tips now watched each other's cradles for signs of corruption. If a baby wailed too long, if a mother whispered hymns instead of lullabies, both became grounds for suspicion. Women traded accusations like currency. I saw her at the well at midnight, gathering black blooms. Her knitting needles formed the devil's crosses. In these whispered trials, deeds of kindness were recast as occult rites. The phenomenon even took on a name in fearful tongues: self-inquisition. Women would show up at the constable's door carrying tokens, pressed herbs, simple hand-sewn shrines, claiming they found them in a neighbor's basket. The victims, confronted with evidence supplied by hands that once clasped theirs in solidarity, had no choice but to recant or face torture. Under oath, many confessed to practices they had never dreamed of, simply to end the nightmare. Children, too, were weaponized in this war of suspicion. Fatigued mothers, fearful for their own lives, instructed their youngsters to watch for strange behavior. A cough in church became a sign of secret prayers to the old gods. A child's sob at bedtime became proof of haunted dreams. At dusk, clusters of children patrolled the streets, pointing fingers at anyone who rode past on horseback, anyone who sang a lullaby in a foreign tune, anyone whose eyes seemed too bright or too dull. Their small voices carried the same deadly weight as torchlight. Even lovers turned informer. An illicit romance between Isabel, a silk weaver's daughter, and Brother Bernard, the new clerk in the parish, came undone when Bernard, fearing exposure of their forbidden tryst, reported Isabel for witchcraft. He claimed her midnight visits were for spells. He delivered her shawl, a piece of violet wool scrawled with his own childish confession, as proof of unholy liaison. Isabel's screams at the rack echoed across the square, silencing the songbirds and dashing any hope that love could transcend this new order. Enforcers erected gallows at the edge of the village, hung with the effigies of absent suspects, their straw-stuffed bodies dressed in the robes of nuns and minstrels. The gallows served as grim warnings. The line between innocence and guilt was narrower than a breath, thinner than a spider's thread. Each morning, the villagers passed beneath them in mute procession, casting furtive glances at the dangling figures. Those who looked too long, or too intently, found themselves added to the list of suspects. The marketplace, once the lifeblood of Saint-Hilaire, became a theater of accusation. Women trading eggs would pause mid-transaction to whisper the names of suspicious neighbors. Men bartering wool for cheese now demanded that sacks be opened and inspected for hidden charms. Even bread was sliced and examined for runic symbols burned into the crust. The very act of sharing sustenance, which had bound the community together for generations, now served only to widen the chasm between them. At the heart of this collapse stood Father Guillaume, newly exalted as the Inquisition's local arbiter. He held daily tribunals in the nave, his voice echoing under vaulted ceilings. Villagers presented their accusations before him. He pronounced judgment with a solemn nod. Those condemned were led directly from the church to the camp, their belongings left to be seized by the bailiff. No word of comfort crossed Father Guillaume's lips. His mercy was measured in silent acquiescence to the Inquisition's will. Yet even as the mechanisms of terror ground on, Small sparks of resistance flickered in hidden corners. The blacksmith's apprentice refused to shoe the inquisitor's horses. The baker slipped bread through a loose board to neighbors in hiding. A handful of women formed secret societies beneath the ruins of an old chapel, passing coded messages through the weaving of rush mats. But these acts of defiance were as scattered as embers in a storm, unlikely to ignite a revival of communal trust. By the end of Wave 2, Saint-Hilaire had become a place where every smile hid a blade, every embrace a betrayal. The village that had once gathered as one at harvest festivals now assembled only in lines of the condemned, each life auctioned to fear. In the echo of each execution horn, the people heard not the end of a witch, but the death knell of their own humanity. By the late 15th century, the machinery of the witch hunt had already spread across Europe like a disease. What began in small towns like Saint-Hilaire would, in a matter of decades, explode into continent-wide waves of terror. To understand how the Inquisition's pyres in Normandy resonated with fires across the Atlantic and along the Rhine, we must draw parallels between three emblematic tragedies: Salem, 1692; Trier, 1581 to 1593; and Toulouse, 1562 to 1598. Salem, Massachusetts, 1692. Nearly a century after Catherine's martyrdom, a new frontier in America became the stage for paranoia. In Salem Village, Massachusetts, a cluster of adolescent girls exhibited fits and convulsions, symptoms immediately attributed to witchcraft. Within months, over 200 men and women were accused, 19 were hanged, and one tortured to death in prison. The New England colony's Puritan leaders, convinced they faced a diabolic conspiracy, sanctioned the executions as necessary to protect the godly commonwealth. Here, as in Normandy, fear of the other mutated into a judicial spectacle. Accusations escalated through specters and forced confessions, echoing the torture-driven testimonies of the Inquisition. Trier, Holy Roman Empire, 1581 to 1593. Centuries before Salem's hysteria, Trier in present-day Germany endured one of Europe's deadliest witch hunts. Under the auspices of Archbishop Johann von Schönenberg, inquisitors employed torture chambers beneath the city's palace. Official records enumerate over 3,000 trials in just 12 years, with more than 350 executions by burning or hanging. The meticulous ledgers of the Trier Tribunal reveal chilling statistics. On average, nearly 7 accused were tried each month, and 4 condemned. Entire family lines were eradicated as judges interpreted the most mundane behaviors: ill livestock, a child's fever, as evidence of pacts with the devil. Trier's scale and bureaucratic thoroughness transformed personal vendettas into cold, systematic genocide. Toulouse, France, 1562 to 1598. In southern France, the wars of religion provided fertile ground for witch hunts in Toulouse. Between 1562 and 1598, the Parlement of Toulouse recorded over 1,200 death sentences for witchcraft, largely targeting women in rural hinterlands. Here, as Protestants and Catholics clashed, accusations served political ends. Denunciations of witches often masked campaigns against Huguenot sympathizers. The Parlement's registers show an average of 30 witch trials per year during the height of conflict. Religious zeal became statecraft, and the Inquisition's judicial model, confession under duress, public execution, was replicated across religious divides. Genocide by the numbers. Inquisition records. The Inquisition's archives contain staggering figures that underscore the scope of these persecutions. Spain, 1478 to 1834. Between 1480 and 1530 alone, Spanish tribunals indicted some 2,000 suspected witches, executing roughly 800. Holy Roman Empire, 1550 to 1650. Conservative estimates place the total at over 50,000 trials and 25,000 executions across dozens of principalities. France, 1460 to 1680. Regional parliaments documented approximately 10,000 trials, with at least 3,000 burnings. While numbers vary by region and historian, the cumulative data confirm that witch hunts were not isolated atrocities, but orchestrated campaigns of fear and control. The uniformity of torture manuals, the standardized questions, do you rend agreements with familiars? Have you eaten the devil's cake? And the ubiquity of public burnings reveal a shared playbook far beyond local custom. Witch hunts as social control. Across continents and confessions, the witch hunt functioned as a mechanism of social regulation, reinforcing authority. Rulers and clergy leveraged witch trials to demonstrate power. By proclaiming themselves guardians against demonic threats, they legitimized harsh laws and secret tribunals, scapegoating vulnerable groups. Trials disproportionately targeted widows, midwives, the elderly, and those living on communal margins, groups whose survival often disrupted established hierarchies. Suppressing dissent. In Toulouse, Huguenots were accused of sorcery to justify confiscation of property. In Trier, political adversaries were branded witches to eliminate opposition. Enforcing conformity. The ever-present threat of accusation compelled communities to police behavior internally, eroding trust and turning neighbors into informers. In each context, Salem's Puritan theocracy, Trier's Episcopal state, Toulouse's war-torn region, the formula was the same. Fear of the unseen justified the surveillance of the everyday. Ordinary acts, a cough, a gardening herb, a nocturnal prayer, were reframed as proof of diabolic alliance. Through tribunals and torture, societies converted fear into ritual, and ritual into obedience. As we trace these parallels, a grim pattern emerges. The Inquisition's model of orchestrated torment became a template for communal terror. From Normandy's dungeons to America's frontier, from Trier's palace crypts to Toulouse's halls of justice, the witch hunt was not a series of aberrations, but a singular phenomena, genocide by accusation. In the next wave, we will confront the existential questions that these events pose, about the nature of belief, power, and the human capacity for cruelty. The dawn air in St. Lo's courtyard carried a brittle quiet, an absence louder than any shout. The pyre was ready, stacked high with oak beams and kindling, its black iron chains gleaming like shackles in the weak light. The crowd assembled beyond the ropes, faces drawn and hushed, each spectator burdened by the same unspoken question. Can a society claim holiness when it feeds on sacrifice? Across from the pyre stood Inquisitor Mathieu Delacroix, robed in starched white surplice and black cassock stained by past ceremonies. His eyes, once stern with divine conviction, now flickered with something raw, doubt, or perhaps grief. In his left hand, he held a leather-bound register, its pages fat with the names of the condemned. In his right, a simple iron brand, its tip still warm from yesterday's marking. He surveyed the hushed congregation, feeling the weight of every expectant gaze. For years, Delacroix had believed in the righteousness of his mission, that by purging heresy, he purified both the individual soul and the communal body. Yet this morning, as the sun's first rays kissed the pyre, he heard in his mind a different question, one that no sermon had prepared him to answer. Is this sanctity or sin? His steps echoed as he ascended the scaffold, each footfall a small betrayal of the oath he had taken. The condemned woman at the base of the pyre was barely more than a girl, no more than 17, with wide gray eyes and a tremor in her shoulders. She wore a shift of coarse linen, her wrists bound by hempen rope. Around her neck hung a crucifix, her last token of faith. Delacroix's voice, when he spoke, trembled. You have confessed to consorting with demons, to invoking storms, to plotting against Holy Mother Church. Do you stand by your confession? The girl's lips parted in a ragged breath. Not wholly, she whispered. I confess to save my brother. They threatened him. Her eyes darted to the crowd, where a boy no older than 10 pressed against his mother's skirts, face pale as urine. At that moment, Delacroix felt a fissure open beneath his feet. He recognized the girl's fear. It was the same fear he once saw in his own sister's eyes when he told her to tremble before sin. He realized that in every confession he had coerced, he had broken more than bones and spirits. He had shattered trust, reshaped hearts, and in doing so, had created an army of ghosts haunting the present. He raised the iron brand, but his hand shook. The metal's heat bit at his palm, reminding him that it was forged not for healing, but for marking sinners as cattle. In that searing pressure, he felt it again, the question he had buried beneath scripture and steel. Can holiness be bought with blood? The girl looked up at him, awareness dawning in her fear-browned eyes. Father, she said, voice trembling but clear, you judge me as a witch, but I see only fear in your eyes. You hunt me to save your world, but who will save yours from this fire? Silence fell deeper than the dawn shadows. The onlookers shifted uneasily, a collective intake of breath that felt like a benediction of guilt. Delacroix's heart thundered. He felt the echo of every soul he had condemned, every life he had ended. He closed his eyes, recalling his first trial, a woman accused of cursing the harvest. She wept as he read the charges. He felt pride in his righteousness, but pride, he now knew, was a seed that grew thorns. In his zeal, he had carved a mirror that reflected only his own fear of doubt, and he had forced every accused to gaze into it until their identities shattered. He opened his eyes and let the brand drop from his hand. The iron clanged on the wood, startling the crowd. The girl looked at him, hopeful, and the boy in the front row gasped. Delacroix's voice broke as he spoke. He swallowed, striving for the composure of the man he used to be. I cannot. He turned to the bailiff at the pyre's base. Release her. A murmur of shock rippled through the assembly. Guards shifted, uncertain whether to obey. The bailiff's jaw tightened. Then he nodded. Knots of rope fell away from the girl's wrists, and she sank to her knees, weeping in relief and disbelief. Delacroix stepped to the edge of the scaffold and addressed the congregation. Today, we confront not a witch, but ourselves. We have practiced sacrifice, but it was our own humanity we offered. His voice grew steadier as he continued. No faith that demands blood can claim the name of mercy. No ritual of death can sanctify our souls. Gasps and whispers spread through the crowd. Some faces fell. Others writhed in confusion. A few hardened, as if the words cut through their convictions. The boy at the edge of the assembly looked up at Mathieu, eyes wide with hope and fear. Delacroix descended the scaffold, each step heavy but resolute. He approached the girl, kneeling to meet her gaze. "Live," he told her softly. "Live, and bear witness to this day." The girl's tears glistened as she nodded. Beyond her, the crowd began to stir, restless under the weight of the Inquisitor's confession. The pyre remained behind them, its blackened timbers unlit, a monument to the violence they refused to unleash. As Mathieu walked away, he carried with him the echo of that question, now seared into his own soul. How can holiness endure when founded on sacrifice? In that question lay both condemnation and hope, the final verdict and the first step toward redemption. And as the village dispersed, no longer united by terror, but shaken by mercy, Mathieu understood that the true trial was not of the accused, but of every human heart that sought to live in the shadow of the flame. 4 centuries later, in the vaulted archives beneath Toledo's great cathedral, Anais de Beaumont brushed dust from a leather-bound volume larger than her forearm. The Dominican tract, its spine cracked, pages yellowed, had been catalogued long ago, then forgotten. But Anais, a scholar of suppressed histories, sensed its promise, a truth buried beneath layers of orthodoxy. She pried the cover open, revealing margins scrawled in an elegant 16th century hand, Latin phrases intertwined with hieroglyph-like symbols. Yet beneath the primary text lay faint, erased writing, a palimpsest. Light from her lantern trembled over those ghost lines, coaxing them into sight. Anais fetched a thin blade and gently scraped away the newer ink. Underneath, a damning confession emerged. These trials serve not God, but prince and prelate. The charges of witchcraft are but veils to conceal political expediency. Let no soul speak of this. Frater Petrus de Vallis, O.P. 1563. Anaïs's breath caught. Frater Petrus, Dominican Inquisitor and confidant of the Archbishop, admitted here that every accusation was manufactured, every confession coerced, every pyre lit to eliminate rivals and consolidate power. In that moment, the entire narrative of Catherine's martyrdom collapsed. She smoothed the page and reached for a second fragment of papyrus tucked between the leaves. This was Catherine's own letter, the one she never finished. Anais carefully unfolded it, revealing the 10-year-old girl's broken lines. "Do you see how the fire?" Now, under the lantern's glow, those trailing words glowed in Anaïs's mind. Each ember of suffering was recorded not for salvation, but for statecraft. Shaking, Anais gathered manuscripts and scrolls, racing through corridors of stone. Candle holders rattled as she passed, the monastery dreaming in shadows. She carried the evidence to the modern library hall, where colleagues awaited her lecture. They leaned forward as she laid the palimpsest and the daughter's letter side by side. "Behold," Anais said, voice trembling with revelation. Catherine of Normandy was not a witch. She was a political obstacle. Her healing arts and independent spirit threatened the church and crown. Her pyre was a statement, not a sentence. A stunned silence swept the chamber. Historians exchanged glances, some of triumph, others of dismay. At that moment, the centuries-old metahook snapped shut. The secret architects of terror had been unmasked. Anais closed her eyes and envisioned Catherine's face, defiant, sorrowful, radiant in flame. She saw Etienne's final blessing, Julien's betrayal, and Delacroix's confession all woven into one tapestry of power and pain. The letter's last lines, never read, now burned bright. If you see me, spare my soul. Anais inhaled sharply. The words echoed in the hush, transforming from a child's plea into a universal indictment of every institution that thrives on sacrifice. She turned to her audience. History, like a palimpsest, conceals as much as it reveals. Today, we strip away the lies and confront the bitter truth. Catherine died not for heresy, but for autonomy. Let her real story be our reckoning. As she stepped down from the dais, the hushed hall broke into murmurs of shock, liberation, and grief. Some wept at the injustice, others clenched jaws, anger sharpening their faces. Yet in that tumult rose a fragile hope, knowledge as emancipation. In the centuries since Catherine's death, long-buried archives had lain silent, until now. Her epitaph, once etched simply as "Here lies a witch," would be rewritten. No longer a phantom of superstition, Catherine would emerge as a martyr of conscience, a victim of political cruelty, dressed in the guise of divine justice. Anais held the fragments close, both the track's confession and the child's letter, now complete in her hands. She felt the weight of their union, shock at the reveal, liberation in the unmasking, bitterness at centuries of manipulation. In that crucible of truth, history itself was reborn. And in the faint, final line of Catherine's plea, "Spare my soul," Anais heard a call across time, for every age to guard its mercy more fiercely than its power. The square in Rouen bristled with torches and wooden scaffolds, but an unusual hush had settled over the crowd. Months of sermons and denunciations had primed them for spectacle, yet now their faith felt fragile, as if the very air held doubts too heavy to speak aloud. In the center of the scaffold stood Catherine of Normandy, her wrists bound with iron, her makeshift wooden cross tucked beneath her linen shift. Smoke from distant pyres drifted on the wind, an acrid reminder of all the condemned who had faced this fate before her. Father Guillaume climbed the steps, his white robe stained with ash. He raised his hand, ready to pronounce the sentence learned by rote, that heresy must be purged by fire. But as he gazed at Catherine's calm face, eyes bright with the flame of conviction, words caught in his throat. In that moment, the scaffold became a mirror. Every man and woman present saw reflected in her stead their own capacity for cruelty, their own complicity in this ritual of blood. A murmur rippled through the crowd. "Is this justice?" A child's sob broke the silence. Julian, grown now into a young man, stood at the edge of the square, tears staining his cheeks as he remembered the day he betrayed his mother. An elderly midwife, once Marguerite's friend, pressed a hand to her mouth, recalling the herbs that had once saved her grandchild's life. Merchants, guards, even inquisitors shifted uncomfortably, eyes darting away from Catherine's still form. Catherine lifted her head and addressed the masses, her voice carrying over the hush. "Behold the accused," she said, "not for murder or treachery, but for mercy. I healed wounds you would have deepened. I spoke truths you would bury, and for this, you burn me." A gust of wind snuffed half the torches. Shadows danced across the scaffold planks. The crowd gasped, and in that gasp, the first crack appeared in the edifice of fear. "I do not ask for your forgiveness," Catherine continued, "for forgiveness is not my role. I stand here so you may feel the weight of your own deeds. When you throw me into the flames, know that each ember carries your reflection." Silence fell deeper than night. Father Guillaume lowered his head. tears glinting on his cheeks. He raised the hand that should have spoken judgment and instead let it fall to his side. The bailiff behind him hesitated, sword half raised. The crowd watched as the instruments of execution, iron rods, kindling, fetid oils, lay inert, powerless to proceed without the priest's command. One by one, torches were lowered. Guards loosened Catherine's bonds. The pyre's timbers, blackened but unlit, stood as mute witnesses to the implosion of ideology. Where once there was certainty, now there was doubt. Where once there was unity around terror, now there was fracturing awareness that the true witch hunt had been aimed inward. Julian stepped forward, crossing the threshold from spectator to participant. He knelt before Catherine, pressing a damp cloth to her wrist where the iron had branded her flesh. "Mother," he whispered, voice trembling, "they see you now." Catherine smiled, a slow, radiant curve that spoke of both sorrow and triumph. "They see themselves," she replied, "and that sight is the first step toward mercy." Above them, a solitary bell tolled, neither for death nor for victory, but for awakening. The square exhaled, a collective release of breath that carried both relief and grief. In that moment, the climax gave way to purification, as the crowd's guilt was transmuted into contrition. The scene fades from medieval Rouen to a modern-day museum in the same city. Natural light filters through high windows, illuminating exhibits of stone shackles, charred wood fragments, and Catherine's recovered cross, now catalogued not as relics of heresy, but as artifacts of injustice. Visitors walk silently among the displays, pausing before a touchscreen that loops Catherine's final words. "When you see the flames, look for your own face." A mother gently guides her daughter past a glass case containing the 10-year-old girl's smudged letter, now transcribed in full. Under the pristine script lies the haunting plea, "Do you see how the fire?" And the line once lost to ashes has been restored. "Agates my soul." Beyond the museum's corridors, a children's playground hums with laughter. Swings arc against a blue sky. A carousel spins slowly. Under the surface, hidden from casual view, lie the fractured bones of those burnt at the stake, untold victims of a mercy that demanded blood. Only a discreet plaque hints at the secret beneath. Here lie the remains of those condemned as witches. Their truth freed us. May their memory bind our compassion. A young descendant of Catherine, perhaps Anaïs's heir, stands before this plaque, her reflection wavering on its polished surface. She places a single white rose on the grass. Then she steps back and speaks softly, as though reciting a prayer. Silence is the only memory that survived. In this stillness, we carry their stories. In this silence, we learn what mercy truly costs. A soft breeze stirs the petals. The rose drifts, settling beside the plaque. Children's laughter swells and fades, mingling with the distant hum of city life. In that quiet, the final mirror to the opening emerges. The child no longer screams. She watches. And as the descendant walks away, head bowed in reflection, the playground stands as both testament and warning that the echoes of flame endure, and that the only safeguard against history's repetition is the vigilant remembrance of those who perished in trial without witnesses. In the cavernous hush that follows every scream of flame, a single question reverberates through time and faith. Can anything be called holy when built upon the sacrifice of blood? We invoke sanctity in temples and courts alike, Yet in the shadow of every altar lies the echo of the pyre. We train our tongues to pronounce mercy, even as our hands ignite the torch. Is our faith pure, or is it the fire itself, hungry, devouring those we deem unworthy? Across centuries, we have fashioned devils in our image, strange shadows to justify the hunt. We blamed herbs for sorcery, tears for weakness, silence for guilt, but those specters were born of our own fear. Fear of difference, of doubt, of the unfathomable vastness that lies beyond doctrine. Do we chase demons beyond our walls, only to discover they were reflections in our own eyes? Memory is our only bulwark against repetition. We can read the charred ledger of Toulouse, the screaming confessions from Trier, the hush of Salem's gallows, and vow never again. Yet memory fades. In the lull between textbooks and documentaries, in the cold corridors of forgotten archives, the ember of fanaticism smolders. Is remembering enough to prevent the next hunt? Catherine's letter, now whole, delivers its final plea across 400 years. Do you see how the fire ignites my soul? We repeat her words in every classroom and every speech. Yet in the moment of decision, when our neighbor's belief strays, when our leader demands obedience, when our conscience recoils, we find God silent, not absent, but burning with us, the divine in solidarity with suffering, yet offering no words to ease the pain. In those silent embers lies our challenge, to face the unanswered question with courage, to transform guilt into vigilant compassion, and to listen for truth, not in thunderous proclamations, but in the soft ash at our feet. Silence becomes our final act of worship, a 10-second void at the end of this story. No music, no voice, only the weight of shared stillness. In that silence, we honor those who perished, and we vow to guard our mercy more fiercely than our power. And as the screen fades, you once more hear the child's whisper, "Do you see me, God?" In that unspoken moment, the audience becomes both witness and jury. The question lingers, will we heed the silence, or will we light another fire?